RTX is easily the most overused term in the gaming industry, and it might just be a scam. RTX is NVIDIA's line of GPUs that support hardware ray tracing. NVIDIA switched from the GTX to the RTX branding all the way back in 2018 with the release of the RTX 20 series. They marketed ray tracing as the future of gaming, a technology that would change how developers and players interacted with games. And if you wanted to use it, you needed their hardware. But what was it actually like? For starters, barely any game supported ray tracing. Less than 20 games supported RTX by the end of 2020, 2 years after the initial launch. Battlefield 5 and Shadow of the Tomb Raider were the first two showcase games, with Battlefield 5 showing ray traced reflections and Shadow of the Tomb Raider having ray traced shadows. And to say it was disappointing would be an understatement, for multiple reasons. The biggest one being the performance. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, using a 2080 Ti, the flagship of that generation that retailed for 1,000 USD, enabling ray tracing essentially drops your FPS by half. NVIDIA's solution was DLSS. The problem that this was DLSS version 1.0. Compared to DLSS 4 and 4.5 today, it honestly looked terrible. As for the GPUs that most people were using, they recommended you to either turn down resolution, use their upscaling, turn down other graphics settings, just so you can use ray tracing, which feels completely backwards. If you're the type of person who would enable RT, you clearly care about image quality. And the situation gets even worse in competitive games. Putting ray tracing into games like Battlefield 5 is essentially pointless. Most competitive players won't use it because it drastically lowers FPS and can even reduce visibility. Two things that are pretty important to a competitive player. That's why the RTX 20 series was received so poorly. Ray tracing was the headline feature, but the hardware was not powerful enough to deliver the experience NVIDIA was selling. And honestly, if you bought a 20 series card specifically for RT, you got scammed. Even the RTX 30 series with the second gen RT cores still struggle to provide an experience good enough to justify the performance loss. But that was in 2018. So what is the experience like now? Well, it is okay. While the price of entry has gone down, ray tracing still isn't something every class of GPU should be using. And unfortunately, the technology behind ray tracing is moving faster than the GPUs themselves. In my opinion, the minimum GPU for a decent ray tracing experience today is something like the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB or the RX 9060 XT 16GB. The 5060 Ti is currently around $570 and the 9060 XT is around $440. Now we have things like path tracing, which is basically a even more demanding version of RT that exists just to give people FOMO and get them to spend more money. But before we get into the visuals, let's talk about performance. Looking at the Steam hardware survey from May, the RTX 3060 is still the most popular GPU, followed by the 4060 laptop GPU, then the desktop 4060. All of these GPUs struggle with ray tracing, yet NVIDIA continues to market them like they can actually handle it. To even attempt ray tracing on any of these cards, you're usually looking at 1080p, upscaling, and frame generation, and to me, that is just not worth it. Now let's look at the actual performance differences. Using my current PC with a 4070 Ti Super, and starting with Cyberpunk, using the Ultra Quality preset at 1440p with DLSS quality, and then the Ray Tracing Ultra preset at 1440p at DLSS quality. Without RT, I'm getting around 121 FPS on average. With RT, I'm getting around 89 FPS on average, which is about a 36% performance loss just from turning on RT. Moving over to Black Myth Wukong, with the cinematic preset versus the cinematic preset with full RT set to very high, which is actually path trace lighting in this game, we're looking at an average of a 2x performance drop. Then finally, we have Spider-Man 2 with the very high preset and the ray tracing very high preset. We again see a 2x drop in performance, going from 120 FPS on average to around 60. Though keep in mind, I believe with ray tracing, there is a CPU bottleneck in this game, along with Cyberpunk, even with the 7700X. If you have something like a 7800X 3D though, you should be fine. But performance is only half of the problem, because if ray tracing genuinely looks better, then maybe the performance hit is worth it. Going back to Cyberpunk, I would say this is the ray tracing game. The art style of the game works perfectly with ray tracing. Using RT Ultra improves both the lighting, reflections, and shadows, and I didn't even use ray reconstructions for these tests. If you enable it, it looks even better. Then moving over to the RT Overdrive preset, which is Cyberpunk's path tracing mode, this game looks absolutely incredible. And if your hardware can handle it, I genuinely recommend using ray tracing in this game. Also going back to Wukong, it's also a very good showcase for RT. Using full ray tracing at the very high adds a huge amount of depth to most scenes. You're getting path trace lighting, ray trace shadows, reflections, and path trace caustics. And visually, it looks amazing. The problem is that it's just so demanding in this game. Personally, I played the game with medium RT with some DLSS DLSS. Shadows and reflections do drop in resolution and the caustics are just gone, but I think it's a good compromise for the performance. But not every game can go without visual issues. Forza Horizon 6, for example, this game adds ray trace lighting and reflections, and I think this game is a perfect showcase of how ray tracing still isn't perfect. Even on the max RT setting, there's a noticeable amount of noise in certain areas. Typically in indirect light and dark areas is where it's the most noticeable. And this isn't unique to Forza, it's just a consequence of not having a good enough denoiser like ray reconstruction. Personally, I still think the game looks better with RT enabled. It adds depth, contrast, and helps improve some of the screen space reflections. But if you prefer a cleaner image and more FPS, I completely understand leaving it off. It still looks really good without it. Now for the last game I want to take a look at, Crimson Desert. This is the first game I've played where ray tracing was the main focus in development, and for the most part, performance is actually pretty decent, but at times, it genuinely looks horrible. It has to be the most inconsistent looking games I've ever played. Sometimes it looks absolutely beautiful, others like garbage. The same issue that Forza Horizon 6 had is 10 times worse here. There's so much noise in darker areas, especially indoors and at night. Now, luckily this game does have ray reconstruction, which fixes those problems, but turning it on halves your FPS regardless of the GPU that you have. And what's funny is that ray tracing is only now becoming what Nvidia promised back in 2018. 8 years later, the visuals are finally impressive enough that I actually want to use them, but it's still expensive, it's still demanding, and in multiplayer games, it's still pretty much pointless. So no, I don't think ray tracing today is a scam. If you are a 20 series owner who bought it just for RT though, yeah, you got scammed.